Yes. Well, my name is Denise Rousseau, and I'm a professor at the university in the United States called Carnegie Mellon, and I'm a professor both in public policy and in the business school, which is both a dichotomy and a range of students and problems. I started out in life as an industrial psychologist because my father hated his job. And that motivation to think about how we could do work design better was what got me into graduate school in organizational psychology. I'm the first in my family to go to college, and I wanted it to be a useful education. Over time, as an organizational psychologist, I tried to figure out how best to get at the issue of the experience people have at work. And after about 10 years of studying job design and supervisor-subordinate relations, it occurred to me that there was becoming a breakdown in the nature of the relationship between people and their organizations. And the concept of a psychological contract emerged in my thinking. And the psychological contract is this notion that people hold beliefs and understanding about what they owe their employer and what they can expect and are owed in return. And what I was seeing was both a lot of violation of that psychological contract, as well as the formulation of some new kinds of deals that actually seem to be working. And that's kind of given me a path in the last few years to try to work on the problem of, well, as organizations change, and change we must, is there a way that we can make deals that we can keep? And is there a way to make change that is kinder to the people than the way we often do? Yes. So as I think about a psychological contract and the way we study the phenomenon today, a psychological contract is an individual's beliefs about, it's a system of beliefs, actually, in terms of what the person owes another and what that other owes them in return. So it's a relationship of obligations based to a great extent on promises and commitments, but also based over time, if the arrangement continues, on the kind of contributions each makes to another. And as we receive more from another party, we often feel obligated to return more to them. And so it's not just promises, it's also the quality of what's given and taken that shapes what the contract evolves to be over time. The work of Mauss on gifts is very, very important because the idea of what we receive from another, what resources are offered and what resources are returned, so defines both the nature of the current relationship, but also the expectations for the future. And one of the important aspects of a psychological contract is it's a belief not only about what's present between us, but also what's likely to happen as we go forward. Just think of the incredible power of being able to ask somebody to do something today for a reward or a benefit that won't materialize for some time. You get the benefit of their contribution, their effort, their great ideas, their investment, and don't immediately necessarily have to give anything. But over time, if that interaction continues, this may be the person you promote, the person you develop, the person who you ask, well, what do you want this job to be? And as they go forward, the relationship between the two becomes more valuable. If you can't make promises about what could happen in the future, we really can't live. We can only live hand to mouth, day to day. So there's a huge value in being able to make promises people can trust and rely on. And if we lose the ability to make promises about the future, we lose a tremendous amount of potential for control and influence over what can happen in the future. And that's actually the reason why I think the psychological contract is important, not just because it matters to people how they're treated today, but it also matters what they anticipate the future will be. And we will do a lot and sacrifice a lot in the present if we think the future it will bring us is compelling. So there's a powerful relationship between the notion of a psychological contract and the trust people have between themselves and another. Issue with regard to trust. Trust is basically the willingness of somebody to be vulnerable, to put themselves at risk to what the other might do. And if a psychological contract is about beliefs in what will happen in the future based on the interactions we have today, it's founded on trust. If trust does not exist, you cannot form a psychological contract, which means you can't make promises today that will be paid for tomorrow. You can't ask somebody to help you now in return for something in the future. Only trust makes that possible. At the same time, if a psychological contract exists, people have a belief that there's a bond, set of obligations between themselves and another that helps them realize their goals, help them know what to expect next, trust will deepen. So some trust is needed for psychological contracts to begin, but trust is enhanced and strengthened as psychological contracts are lived over time and as they are met. Okay, so when we say psychological contract breach, that basically means that the person believes that the other party did not keep its commitments, did not fill its obligations. So one logically would expect if the other party didn't meet its commitments, distrust will result. But there's a very interesting phenomenon with regard to psychological contracting processes. Because psychological contracts are all in the head. They're in the perception and they're in the heart. What the starting point from which people experience their employment relationship is very important to how it evolves. And if we start from a perception of trust and openness, when people trust, view the relationship in general terms. I'm optimistic. I'm not scrutinizing. I'm going forward in the day-to-day giving and getting. But when we don't trust, mistrust leads to negative emotion, negative affect, we say in psychology. And negative affect causes people to be vigilant, scrutinize, to be skeptical. And when you scrutinize, it means you're looking for discrepancies. You're looking for problems. And if you look for problems, you look for discrepancies, you look for, has the other party breached its psychological contract with me, you will find. And so one of the issues is once we start from a position of distrust, psychological contract breach escalates. Without the other party even becoming less responsible, meaner, or more insensitive, it's because we've changed the perceptions on the part of the individual. And if people mistrust, they will evaluate situations very differently than they would if they came from a perspective of trust. So that's a very good question, and it's an important issue. So the idea that distrust has increased and that it's a societal phenomenon, it indicates a couple of things. Knowing that distrust is high means that vigilance, that searching for negative information, searching out and seeking evidence of contract breach, of discrepant and undesirable behavior on the part of the government, on the part of others. That's inherent when people start from a position of distrust. If you seek negative information, you will find negative indicators. But you asked the important question, how did we get here? So let's think about the kinds of things that cause people to feel negatively about the world and negatively about themselves. It's one thing for an individual to have that, and that can evolve over time as things change in one's life. But when we have a societal state of mistrust, we would really look for some broader forces that have generated vulnerabilities, made people feel more insecure, more vulnerable, more in need of scrutinizing the world around them to find out what's wrong and how can I deal with it. I would point to two things that are very, very important. The first is the rising level of insecurity in the risk that now is on the population generally, families and individuals, rather than absorbed by government and organizations. The fact that more burden for social services and social supports falls to individuals and isn't being provided by our companies or by our government is perhaps one cause of that. And I think we can point to both Reaganomics and Thatcherism as sources of that kind of insecurity as risk was offloaded to the population generally. And people aren't necessarily prepared well to absorb that risk. So the second issue, besides the risk shifting to people, is I suspect the idea of that really is at the heart of psychological contracts that work. Psychological contracts are about making a future you find attractive, where you have some optimism. If I sacrifice and work hard today, tomorrow will be better. And my hunch is we've lost that faith in the future. As an American, and my country was founded on a belief that the future would be better than the present. As the children of immigrants, why would we come unless we thought somehow we would get something better than what we had? When we start losing that sense that we can make the future better, that is a source of tremendous mistrust and doubt in the society around us. And that begs the question, what should we do about it? Critical issue, I think, is increasing the capacity of people to be able to build skill and knowledge and information about the opportunities available to them. It's so that's training and education, but it's also social ties to others, because a good bit of our ability to solve problems and make our way in the world is because we're connected to other people. We're connected to people who will help us. We're connected to people who we give advantage to and they help us as well. Our social isolation may well have increased in the time where people were absorbing more risk. We had less time for friends, less time for volunteer organizations, less time for the civil society that makes your life rich and juicy. So how do we get that again? As somebody who works in the area of change management, one of the things I have come to realize is that most effective change happens in social networks. It happens not at the individual level, but the level of communities and groups and work groups and task forces and groups of people in organizations or in the private sector who are interested in a problem. And so the idea would be, how do we feed and support small local social groups to help participate in solving local problems? How do we support them to do things better? And I think a lot of that is, rather than think of governments giving services, why not think of governments providing supports so that people can identify the services they need and work with them? The Canadians are actually probably better at government than Americans today are. And Canada provides many good examples of ways in which community and government come together to say, well, we have a problem here in our city. We have a lot of poor people, but the problem isn't the idea of serving poor people better. It's to help people be less poor, helping them do things that take them out of poverty. And people have information about what they can do and want to do that would help them be less poor, what kind of work they could do, what ways they could help each other, what support they could benefit from. I see that kind of local participation as a way of reducing the insecurity and the negative affect, increasing the optimism that promises we exchange can indeed be kept, and also allowing people who will probably have to absorb more risk than we absorbed in our lives 50 years ago to be more adaptive. So the risk that comes our way, we can manage. So I guess there's two things. One is to prevent acts that violate commitments we have made. So that's the first thing. And so what does that mean? A wise person, he was probably a Frenchman, once said, "Half the promises never kept were never made." That is, we have beliefs about what we're owed, but that's not necessarily the reality. It's not necessarily what the other party, our boss, our organization, understood. We make more valid understandings of what we're owed when we're in quality communication with each other. The more you talk with people, the more time you spend together, the more accurate and mutual are the ideas people have about what they owe each other. The more distant, the more inaccurate, the less agreement. So in terms of making it more likely that people will hold beliefs about what they can expect and what they are owed that are shared, the quality of communication matters. But there's a second part to this. So that has to do with the nature of the relationship. The other part of it, and from a perspective of government, I think this is a huge issue, and that is the greater the capacity people have for autonomy and self-management, the easier it is for people to make their way in relationship to others. So when a deal has to change, somebody who has resources in the bank, somebody who has high skills, somebody who has learned to be proactive and participate in solving problems is going to be more robust in the face of change. So we have to help people be robust. We probably cannot slow the pace of change. We can manage the quality of the intervention. We can also help people be more resilient. How do you become more resilient? If I had a group of MBA students before me, I'd say, you guys start saving your go-to-hell money. Because if you have more money in the bank and you don't like what's going on in your company, you leave. The average citizen, the go-to-hell money possibilities aren't that great. Number one, because they don't want to leave their home. They don't want to pick up and go somewhere else. So just having the ability to go somewhere else is not necessarily a solution for issues that are generated by change. In that case, what we really want is to have people with more autonomy, the ability to express what they need and want, the ability to negotiate how they make that happen. And as I said earlier, the more social ties people have, the less isolated, the more connected, the more parties you have to, well, can you help me with this? I'll give you this in return. The more opportunities you have to broaden and strengthen your course of action, your range of negotiation, and the less vulnerable you are to the loss or the threat from an employer, from any one entity in your community. Now, the strength of multiple ties is very important. What harms people so much in the context of a psychological contract breach is when this is the key relationship in their world and they live in tremendous fear of loss. Make any one relationship less important so that you have multiple resources. And even in that relationship, that employment relationship, people will deal with their boss. They will deal with the company differently when they deal from strength. None of us is a good partner in a relationship if we're in a position of weakness.